Well, this is really cool. Get some fun ideas out here, and I think one thing that strikes me that we just don't talk enough about or think enough about is right, having dual systems operating in a common space, serving an urban community. There's more, I could say costs more, but there's more expense associated with delivering dual systems than delivering a single system. That expense goes up, and Professor Reback has proposed some, he said, well, let's throw another 20% on that. That's a big chunk to throw onto that to cover these additional, at least short-run expenses needed to operate a second system in the same space. Yet, the policy environment around public schooling, the intersection of public school finance and school choice, has kind of supported this idea, I'll bring these up in a second, that at least state policymakers like to kind of go with the idea that, well, if we operate dual systems in the same space, if we have choice out there, then we don't need to have money out there. It's kind of worked in the opposite direction, that policymakers have adopted a platform of choice as a substitute for equity and adequacy. That if we give liberty of choice, then everyone has equitable opportunity to choose something, which is certainly far from the case. Providing liberty of choice has never yielded equity of opportunity. That policymakers have assumed, well, if we give choices, no matter how much we fund it, people will have access to something that's adequate, if not outright awesome, right? But if we don't fund, be it the traditional public system, or provide sufficient funding for the alternative choices, then what you get is a basket of crappy choices for everyone in a common space. That choice can neither be, it can't be a substitute for equity, it can't be a substitute for adequacy, and in fact, at least during these transition periods of operating two systems in a common space, the costs, or at least the expenses of keeping those systems running, are higher. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that and to fund those additional expenses or costs if we want these systems to be good, one or the other or both. Two systems in one space is more expensive than one, be it the transition costs associated with inefficient allocation of capital assets and human resources, or the additional transportation costs associated with providing the opportunity to ship kids, assuming we're going to provide transportation costs. If we don't, then that's an equity issue, a huge one, in fact. But transportation costs go way up when you provide choice throughout a city, as they did under the New Orleans model, as opposed to doing it more on a location basis. So, that's one of the key issues that policymakers really have to recognize, and I really like the 80-20-20 proposal as if nothing else, an acknowledgement of that, and an acknowledgement of that's built really on the awesome paper, which I repeatedly cite, that you did with Bob Bifulco on Albany and Buffalo, as well as new stuff that's come out from Sonny Ladd on North Carolina school districts. So moving from there, I was just going to kind of go into these same kind of overview issues, and essentially we're really on the same page here on so much of this. Some of this is drawn from my Economic Policy Institute report from about a year or two ago. What are the big questions we have to ask when we're thinking about expanding chartering? And I did some kind of tracking of indicators on charter expansion and fiscal impact across a number of cities around the country. And then, because there are no clear messages that can be drawn nationally or across any two states, or for that matter, any two cities within one state in many cases, or counties, I did try to come up with some synthesizing questions that we should ask. This was what EPI created as a graphic to tweet out, I think, the day that we were doing this. But one of the questions we always have to think about, whether we're talking about Newark, New Jersey, Albany, New York City, Detroit, New Orleans, how is the entire system, not just a subset of schools, meeting measures of quality and equity? We're so obsessed with what I often refer to as the charter traditional public school, the pissing match studies. Who's got the marginal benefit on test score points, right? And if we see a margin, and in fact, that was often used as the basis for arguing for the blunt remove the cap proposal in Massachusetts, Well, we see a marginal benefit of this small subset of charters that operate in Lynn, not actually Boston, and some in Boston, that are then the basis for, well, if they've got a marginal benefit on test scores, graduation rates, and college matriculation, then open-ended charter expansion statewide is necessarily a good policy. What about the system as a whole? In fact, one of the ways to get the marginal test score benefit, one of the ways to win the game is to have a weaker opponent. That's not good for everyone. And we have to be thinking about the system as a whole. Is the system as a whole moving in the right direction? Are the kids in the traditional public schools and the charters that happen to be opening doing better than they would have otherwise had we not operated these dual systems at the higher expense of doing so? Because if they're not doing better as a whole at a higher aggregate expense, then what we've done is just created a less efficient system. What are the risks? We've had a lot of talk of this already. What are the risks of sorting students based on need, and are we going to actually get the resources to the right places to make sure that we're compensating for the differences in needs sorted across these schools? One of the central areas of my work has been around estimating costs associated with student needs toward achieving common outcome goals. And we've done a lot of work on that, looking across districts within states. I've got a new national report out that looks at it kind of across the nation, kind of what are the variations in costs associated with achieving even existing national average outcomes. And there's a lot of talk about how can we create more equitable within district across school resource allocation models to accommodate student needs. One of the most disruptive factors that I've found in my work in evaluating cross-school need-targeted equity is the introduction and expansion of charter schools, because it invariably leads to less predictable, less targeted, and less equitable distribution of resources that is coupled with this uneven sorting of students by their needs. There's this issue of, not only do we have these transition costs associated with, fixed and step costs in schools that can't be immediately kind of wiped off the books in the district as kids transfer to the charter schools, but we often create redundant administrative systems. In fact, this comes out of the Albany and Buffalo work. You guys look, there may be additional administrative costs created by the charter school operators and managers that could have been handled as part of the administrative structure of the district to which those charters are fiscal dependents. So redundant administrative structures, and we picked up some of that in our Maryland work as well, which I'm going to touch on in a few minutes. How does the charter system affect quality of life factors? This transportation thing, I did a side project with, it was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they do a lot of work on healthy and livable communities and walkable spaces, and putting a lot more buses on the road just in the name of school choice, setting aside the additional transportation costs. Reducing active transportation, reducing the amount the kids actually walk to and from school, reducing the community feature. That there are significant adverse health consequences when we reduce the kind of livable and walkable quality of urban spaces. So that's also not to be overlooked here. Does the system, and then when we look at expanding and introducing charter operators, clearly not all charter operators are the same. What's gone on in Michigan is its own fun story. When we talk about charter versus district schools, and we hold up KIPP in Lynn, Massachusetts, and then say that means it's great to expand as many White Hat, Imagine, and Charter Schools USAs as we can in Arizona, Florida, or Michigan. That we can't put, just like we wouldn't put all public schools in one basket, we wouldn't put all private schools in one basket. We wouldn't say Phillips Exeter is awesome, therefore private schooling is great. We also can't do that with charters. We need to look at track record. So now I'm going to try to zip through. The equity issue has been a big concern of mine, that expanding charters in urban contexts has led to inequitable distribution of students, brought up by both people here, and it has not been resolved with more equitable distribution of resources. It has led to vastly inequitable choices and constrained choices. Some of these are the same as the points that were brought up a few minutes ago. There are a handful of factors that affect inequities: distribution of students, distribution of resources to go with them, access to external philanthropy. Some charter chains have much greater access to additional resources than others. Very evident in looking at New York City charter schools, evident in looking in New Jersey. Little less evident when you look in Ohio or Michigan or Arizona, but certainly, apparent even in Washington, D.C., some of the places where the philanthropy is just there to put it behind these charters, also exacerbating the inequities of the choices. Then those are the ones with the longer waiting lists. Fewer kids have access to them. They leverage it for longer years, higher salaries. They spend the additional money on pretty typical stuff. Higher salaries for teachers at the same degree and experience level, to more pay to work longer days and longer years, and have smaller classes. But not everyone gets access to those. It's an inequity. Scale of operations affects inefficiency. Administrative redundancy is a big one, in that we set up districts with their own external district administrative structures within districts. District that's the host is paying money down to the charter school to operate. The district host has services available to the charter school for administrative services, but the charter school pays a management fee to a separate operator entirely to redundantly cover those administrative costs. Transportation goes up with choice systems, and this use and allocation of capital assets is a big deal, because we get all this empty space in Detroit, or we have reduction in the use of publicly subsidized space in Albany or Buffalo, yet a share of the public funds that are going to the charter operator are being channeled through the charter management company to work with a third-party entity through revenue bonds to acquire capital assets at twice the interest rate than the district would have gotten on general obligation bonds. And we're using those public dollars to buy capital assets to be held by private hands. And we're paying exorbitant fees and finance charges to do so, because we've not bothered to think about a coherent system for gaining access to capital. So that's a huge inefficiency thrown into the system. I did an analysis of the interest rates on those revenue bonds, and where the districts might be getting 3.5%, 4%, they're getting like 9.5%. They're getting 3 times the rate in many of the cases. And they're using public dollars to acquire the asset to be held for private hands. Sometimes they're actually using they're using the public dollars, paying an obscene interest rate, to buy a property at below market value from the public that bought it to begin with, because they may be buying a school that the district is selling off. So we bought it twice and we no longer own it. And the second time we bought it, we had exorbitant fees associated with it. So other issues that I've focused on in my work is that we also have, Preston Green and Joseph Olawole and I have written a number of papers about how the rights of voters, taxpayers, children, parents, and employees differ when you introduce private entities as the entity with which teachers and other employees are contracted, the entity that establishes discipline policy for students. When you introduce these private entities as governing what goes on in the schools, you change the rights that are available to kids and families. Kids may not have due process rights related to dismissal in charter schools in many states, where their discipline policies are governed by the private management company, and where it's perceived as contract law between the private management company and the parents who signed off on the discipline policy. Or, as in one California case, dismissal from a charter school may not be a dismissal. It may just be a transfer back to the district schools, therefore not requiring due process. So, it's one thing when we're upfront about this with enrollment in private schools. I think a lot of people who enroll their kids in private schools don't necessarily know that under a private entity, you don't have the constitutional rights that are guaranteed. Our constitutional rights stem from the fact that these government entities are government schools, if you want to call them that. They cannot deprive us of rights to due process, equal protection, things laid out in the Bill of Rights. So the reason this is problematic to me is that we are disproportionately limiting the rights of low-income and minority kids in urban districts. We're saying, oh, this is great, it's fine for 40% of the kids in the city of Newark to go to schools where they may not have these rights, for the voters and taxpayers to not have access to public records on the finances of the charter management companies, because those are private entities not subject to public records, that to not have access to the meetings of the leadership of those companies because they're not subject to public meetings laws, and for the employees to not have constitutional protections they would have as employees of a government entity. That's fine in Newark, but we're not, that would never be allowed in Milburn or Short Hills. That's fine in D.C., but we're not going to subject the suburbs to the same loss of constitutional protections. This unequal distribution of rights, to me, is a huge issue. It's hard to quantify in dollar terms. This ownership and control of assets is a big one. I asked in my Economic Policy Institute report, well, what happens if we change our mind? What happens if we sold all the buildings? I think Professor Rebeck talked about this idea of having the ability, maintaining excess capacity, right? Like New York City has never had the capacity to serve all the kids who are also in the private schools, right? But we want to maintain some. If we sell all these buildings, in fact, we use our own money to buy them from ourselves, but transfer their ownership to private hands, and we decide this was a bad experiment, we no longer have the option to change or changing our mind becomes an incredibly costly endeavor. And we have a lot of cities, 20, 30, 40, over 50% of kids now enrolled in charters, and far less capacity than we would ever need to bring those kids back into a traditional public system. So that ownership issue is huge. Just to point out, we have this report we did on the state of Maryland. I threw these on here because it's nearby. I'm guessing we got some people who live in Maryland here. We did a report, Jesse Levin and Drew Atchison and the crew at AIR and I did a report on Maryland to evaluate the finances and some structural issues in charter schools in Maryland. One of the things that was particularly cool, and a lot of charter advocates will often complain about the restrictiveness of operating charter schools in Maryland, right? Very low rating as a charter school policy from charter. But the charter schools, they are fiscal dependents of the county district. The detailed level of financial data and personnel data that were available to us for this study were above and beyond anything I was ever able to get in other studies, because the charter schools are fiscal dependents that report all of their data, or at least most of their data, up to the district on the district's financial accounting system. They have a separate set of books of their own for their other expenses and management fees and stuff like that, but the State Board of Ed was willing to bring the hammer down on charter operators in Maryland to provide that information to us for our analysis. It was really, in my view, the way fiscal accountability for charter schooling should exist, as a model elsewhere. That we can look at what's being spent, we can look at the compensation for each individual on the books, we can match that to the districts, we can do the comparisons across traditional district schools and charter schools. And we can then model whether or not the charter schools are receiving the appropriate amount of money given who they are serving, and have some confidence that we have precision in the data for making those comparisons. This picture and the broader report also explains that, districts actually carry a whole bunch of other responsibilities. So just comparing a district aggregate per pupil expense to what charters should be getting is invariably a bad comparison, because districts offer summer programs, other community services, other things that aren't the same as the traditional schools versus the charter schools. If we had alternative charter schools in the mix, then the alternative schools come into play here, as would the special schools. Number of little slides that deal with the equity issues. If we look at, I think this is it Prince George's County? Here, this is looking at the predicted expense per pupil and the actual. The point being in Prince George is that the charter schools were invariably serving low-need student populations. They were a little more spread out in Baltimore City. But there were irregularities in how their expenses were distributed, and they disrupted the equity. I have a blog post that shows how charter schools within Baltimore City disrupt attempts to achieve cross-school equity and resources. This is actually the administrative overhead expense for for charter schools across Maryland as a percent of their total reported spending. We often see, and this is combining maintenance and operations, administration, and management fees. We often hear about average administrative expenses being higher in charters. Sometimes it's because of scale. Sometimes it's because of the use of this transfer to the CMO for access to facilities. And the average ends up being, but we don't always see how much variation is there. We had charter schools in Maryland, even under this highly regulated, tightly reported model, spending 50% on overhead. That's just, and this is in a much more tightly regulated system. So I don't want to really kind of jump out there and condemn them, but these are inefficiencies we don't necessarily have to put up with. These are things we need to be looking at to provide the best system for all kids in a common space. We talked in our report, these are straight out of the Maryland report. The URL for access to that report's at the bottom. If anyone can't find it, email me. But creating consistent charter school financial reporting, preparing district financial data systems so that they can track. I'm guessing if we look in the, you guys had to do a lot more forensic work to tease out what was going on in Albany and Buffalo than we had to do in Maryland. I think that the data system really allowed us to do a lot without having to get our hands that dirty, which is what data geeks really like to do. We'll get our hands dirty in these data, but this actual digging into more detailed financial records at the district level is it's just too hard. So we thought, reasonable to establish benchmarks for overhead expenses and to really try to figure out how do we blend these charters into an equitable system. And access to facilities, in my view, this idea of finding efficient ways to share access to capital assets is key, in part so that we don't give away, so we don't sell the farm and give away, because if we change our mind, that's yet another reason we want to have access to this capacity. Even if we change our mind with respect to one or a subset of schools that we believe have served our population very poorly. It's kind of like whether it's buildings or you look at what happened with White Hat and this happens in other places too, where they, any of the material, supplies, and equipment that they've purchased with funds transferred to the CMO have been declared the property of the CMO. We can't let that happen. And that's why Ohio has the White Hat rule now. So those are just my thoughts, and I've probably also, gone over here, but I will pass the ball.
Thank you, Bruce.
And,
Alice.